At 37,000 feet above the Indian Ocean, a perfectly healthy Airbus A330 suddenly pointed its nose toward the ocean. The pilots pulled back on their controls. Nothing happened. The aircraft had decided to ignore them. More than 300 passengers were thrown violently into the ceiling as the jet plunged without warning. Flight attendants slammed into overhead bins. Inside the cockpit, stall warnings and overspeed warnings screamed at the exact same time, something that should have been impossible. Then, just as the crew regained control, the aircraft tried to dive again. This is the story of Qantas Flight 72. On October 7, 2008, Qantas Flight 72 departed Singapore for Perth, carrying 303 passengers and 12 crew aboard an Airbus A330. As Australia came into view, Captain returned from his scheduled rest break and resumed flying. Less than a minute later, warning messages suddenly flooded the flight displays. The autopilot disconnected. Navigation information began disappearing. Altitude and airspeed indications started fluctuating. The crew wasn't just losing information, they were beginning to lose the airplane itself. Without warning, one of the aircraft's air data inertial reference units began transmitting corrupted angle data to the flight control computers. The computers falsely concluded that the aircraft was approaching an aerodynamic stall. Their solution was immediate: force the nose down. The Airbus suddenly pitched toward the ocean. Captain Sullivan instinctively pulled back on his side stick, but for several terrifying seconds the aircraft barely responded. Flight envelope protections were commanding the opposite of what the pilots wanted. By the time control finally returned, the aircraft had dropped hundreds of feet. Passengers who weren't wearing seatbelts had become weightless, smashing into the ceiling before crashing back onto the cabin floor. More than 100 people were injured in just seconds. The crew believed they had survived the worst. They hadn't. As the pilots worked through dozens of ECAM warnings, another system reset was carried out. Then, the impossible happened again. The Airbus abruptly pitched nose down for a second time. Once again, Captain Sullivan pulled back. Once again, the aircraft initially ignored him. The second dive was shorter, but it confirmed something terrifying. This wasn't turbulence, it wasn't pilot error. The airplane could command dangerous maneuvers completely on its own. Realizing another upset at lower altitude could be catastrophic, the crew now focused on one objective: get the aircraft on the ground as quickly as possible. They declared an emergency and diverted to Learmouth, a remote airport on Australia's west coast. Even the approach was filled with uncertainty. The autopilot remained unusable. Autothrust was disconnected. Navigation systems were degraded. Some flight control protections were no longer available, forcing the pilots to hand-fly the Airbus using limited information while constant warning alarms echoed through the cockpit. Inside the cabin, injured passengers and crew waited in silence, unsure whether the aircraft would suddenly dive again. After nearly an hour of manually flying one of the world's most advanced airliners, Captain Sullivan lined up with Learmouth's runway. At 5:32 a.m., Qantas Flight 72 touched down safely. Every one of the 315 people on board survived. But the cabin told the real story.
You're doing very well.
More than 100 people had been injured, many suffering broken bones, spinal injuries, and severe trauma from just 2 unexpected dives. Investigators discovered that the accident began with an internal failure in one air data inertial reference unit, which repeatedly transmitted false angle data to the flight control computers. The computers accepted that faulty data as genuine and automatically commanded nose-down inputs to protect against a stall that never actually existed. The flight control software wasn't adequately designed to reject this rare combination of failures. After the accident, Airbus modified its software, operators updated procedures, and aviation authorities introduced changes intended to prevent the same sequence from happening again.
Learn more about aviation safety. Subscribe for more investigation videos.